Alright, we are back with a new video, and today I decided to discuss what would happen if every season of Survivor had the do or die twist. Now, for those of you who don't know, the do or die twist basically happens at the final 7, and whoever comes in last at the immunity challenge has a 2 in 3 shot of going home, or technically 1 in 3 shot depending on who's doing the math. And I thought this was a bit of an interesting exercise to go through, especially now with this twist being in both 41 and 42. And with it being so controversial, I thought it'd be interesting to see just how much the game would change if they had this twist. So before we get started, I figured it'd be best to break down the ground rules for this video. So what I did was I went through every season of Survivor US that does not have the do or die twist, mainly Borneo through Winners at War, and I rewatched the Final 7 Immunity Challenge for those seasons and tried to figure out who came in last place for each of those. Now, for some of them, obviously, was very easy with it being endurance challenges. Obviously, the first person out is the person involved. However, most seasons do not have an endurance challenge at the final 7, so it required a bit more involvement with watching the challenge, following the edit, and there were a few seasons where it was very hard to figure it out and determine who was the furthest away from winning, but I did my best to break that down. Now, there are two exceptions to this rule, one being Panama and the other being Micronesia, as both those seasons had medevacs at the final 7 before the immunity challenge, meaning that those seasons did not have a final 7 immunity challenge. So for those, I decided to instead use the final 6 immunity challenge with the assumption that that would have been the final 7 immunity had that person not been medevaced. So that's another thing to take into account. And obviously, you can clearly tell that just simply due to the fact that not all of these are endurance challenges, that this concept doesn't necessarily work for all these seasons. Obviously, if all these seasons had a do or die, that for one, they would have made all these seasons had an endurance challenge at the final 7. But also, if every season had this twist right from the get-go, if this were a thing from Borneo and continued all the way through, then over time the meta would change, the strategy would change, causing the majority alliance or people within the game to change how they strategize in order to position themselves for this type of twist. So to account for that, I'm just going to assume that for each season, they were going to introduce it for the first time. So in that regard, we can just assume that each season played out the same up until the final 7. So nothing in terms of the meta changing. Next up is to account for people sitting out of the immunity challenge, as one feature of the do or die twist in the actual show is that people are given the choice to either compete in the challenge and risk being involved in do or die, or sitting out of the immunity challenge, giving up immunity, but also ensuring that they won't fall victim to this. Now, for most seasons, I'm just going to assume that everyone participates in the immunity challenge. There are a couple exceptions where I'll break down cases where the person that came in last probably would sit out, assuming they are in a good enough position to where they would feel comfortable sitting out. However, again, I don't want to rely too much on people sitting out, as that involves a level of variance. So for those reasons, I'm going to have everyone participate in the immunity challenge. And along a similar note is the probability factor, where obviously in the actual do or die twist, the person who comes in last in the immunity challenge is not guaranteed to be eliminated per se, as they do still have a chance to save themselves through probability. However, for this exercise, I'm just going to assume that every person that comes in last is automatically eliminated. We can just pretend that in each scenario we'll be breaking down that the person involved just drew the bad option and is eliminated. So we're basically going to try to streamline this as much as possible. So those are some general ground rules that I'll be applying to this exercise. But with that, there are 40 seasons to cover, so let's dive right in. So first up, we have Survivor Borneo, where at the final 7, they had a fire making challenge for immunity. And I'll say straight up that for a lot of these early seasons, it's kind of hard to follow what exactly happened in these challenges, as one, Jeff doesn't narrate them, but also they're edited in a way to focus a lot on the front runners of the challenge and not so much the people in the back of the pack. And obviously with it focusing a lot on the front runners, it's not really as invested in seeing who's like in the middle and who's at the very back of the pack. So that was a bit hard to figure out for some of these early seasons. But for Borneo, at least, there was a clear person in last place, and that is Jervis. And Jervis will be eliminated from the game due to do or die. And considering he was the actual final boot in the actual show, not much really changes. I mean, the Toggy Alliance probably still Pagongs the rest of the Pagong tribe. We get the same Final Four, assuming the same stuff happens. We still get the same ending where Rich probably wins. So this scenario isn't that exciting. Next up, we have the Australian Outback, which also had a fire making challenge at the final 7. But this one was actually a lot harder to follow. I mean, especially in terms of finding out who was in last place by the end of it, especially with the format of the challenge being that they were trying to make a fire in a bucket and they had to do it to fill up a bunch of water. That was very hard to follow compared to Borneo's, which was just a regular fire making challenge. But for this video, I'll say that Amber was in last place as she got the least amount of screen time during the challenge and never seemed to be a frontrunner at any point. And I also think this is a more interesting scenario to go through, as it would allow the Cooches to come into the final 6 tied in numbers. The Ogre side would have been at a massive disadvantage on previous votes, with Keith having 5 and Colby having 9. And while Colby won the final 6 immunity in real life, Nick, his toughest challenge competition, would still be in the game in this scenario. And obviously with Nick being a lot more competent in challenges, had Nick won that final 6 challenge, the Cooches are guaranteed to win out the vote there, as they would have known for certain Colby would lose the tiebreaker, which at this point in Survivor history was previous votes. And even if Colby wins that immunity, as long as the Cooches throw their votes on the Keith, which likely would have happened anyway, they win out anyway. And from that point on, the Cooches side would have had the advantage and picked up the Ogre cores. Now, granted, it's possible Colby could have won out from that point, assuming Keith goes home at 6, but it becomes a much tougher road with Nick there. And assuming that Roger, Elizabeth, and Nick get to the end together, obviously Nick would need to win final immunity, as Roger and Elizabeth would have taken each other. But even if he were to do that, I don't think he's guaranteed to win a jury vote, as it's never seemed like he bonded closely with a lot of the people in the game. I think Roger also beats him straight up if he took him to the end. And even if he took Elizabeth, I think the jury would have been more sympathetic to Elizabeth than to Nick, especially if Roger's there fighting for her. And in the Roger-Elizabeth final 2, assuming one of them won final immunity instead, I think Roger would win straight up. However, I think he would also try to give up his game to let Elizabeth win. So again, I think Elizabeth would be the most likely winner regardless of the scenario. But regardless, I think if Amber goes out through do or die, that it radically changes the season. Next up, we have Survivor Africa, where at the final 7, we have the Folklore Challenge. And this one was another one that was very, very difficult to follow. And especially with Jeff not making it clear who had what at any given time. And especially towards the end where it was a relatively close contest. Now, based on the edit, where we see the cuts right before the challenge ends, we do not see Ethan getting a 4th point. So I'm going to assume he was the one in last place. Now, I don't know if that was actually the reality of the situation, but considering that it leads to a very interesting endgame, I'm going to let it slide. And as I alluded to a moment ago, Ethan going out through do or die changes a lot of this endgame. So coming into 6, similar to Australian Outback, we'd have Baran and Samburu tied in numbers. However, Lex would have the biggest disadvantage with having the most previous votes, with 6 at this point. So assuming the vote sticks to tribal lines, Samburu will gain the number straight up. I'm sure Baran would try to flip Kim Powers, who would be at the bottom of the Samburus at this point. However, I don't think she would bite, as she would basically be fighting for 4th place if she went with the Barans. Whereas with the Samburus, yes, she would have to win final immunity. However, that's at least guaranteed 3rd place there, so I think she would take that option. And from there, the Samburus would get the numbers and pick off the old Barans. Now, the question, though, is whether Kim Johnson still goes on her immunity run, as she won the final 2 immunity challenges in real life. And I think in this scenario, she would be the last Baran standing, as they would obviously take out Lex at 6 and Big Tom at 5. Now, if Kim Johnson does go on her immunity run, I think we get a tie at the final 4 between Kim Powers and Frank, where Frank loses on previous votes. And at final 3, I assume Kim Johnson takes Kim Powers to the end if she wins that immunity as well, where Kim Powers more than likely beats her. Now, alternatively, if Kim Johnson doesn't go on a run, she goes at a 4 or 3, I guess. And at 3, Kim Powers would need to win final immunity. Now, given its hands-on and hard idol, I suspect that Kim Powers is the most likely person there to win final immunity, especially against Frank and T-Bird. And I think she would most likely take T-Bird to the end, where T-Bird would beat her. Now, you could make the argument that she takes Frank to the end as an easy beat, and that could happen, although I'm pretty sure she would have T-Bird winning more palatable than taking Frank to the end. So I think as a result, T-Bird would be the most likely winner, although I wouldn't be surprised if Kim Powers would also pull off a win as well. Now moving on to Survivor Marquesas, we're at the final 7. Tammy came in last place, and considering she was the real life final 7 boot, not much changes, so we don't really have much to cover here. Now moving on to Survivor Thailand, which is a very similar story to Marquesas, where at the final 7, Penny was the first one out of the endurance challenge, and again, she was the actual final 7 boot. The Chuigons already had the numbers and were committed to picking up the Sukjais, so not much changes here either. Now moving on to Survivor the Amazon, which again is a similar story where it was the Q&A challenge at the final 7. Heidi had the lowest score there, and she would be eliminated there. And again, I don't think much changes either. I feel like Alex would largely take Heidi's spot there, where I think Christy would still go out at 6, and at 5, Rob would get Matt and Butch on board to vote out Alex, and I think the rest of the game plays out pretty similarly. Now we're moving on to Survivor Pearl Islands, and here we have Krista being the first one out of the challenge. Now this could be interesting, although at the end of the day, I don't think much changes. So first up, this came right after the Rupert blindside, which left Krista and Sandra on the outs, and with Krista going out, Sandra would be left with Dara and Tijuana, 2 people that were not as loyal to her as Krista was, and while she could try flipping those 2 against Burton and Fairplay, even then it would only be a 3-3 tie. She would need to also flip Lil. However, I don't think Lil was ready to flip on them before the final 5, so I think Tijuana would still go at the final 6, especially since Sandra would be seen as even less of a threat now without Krista in the game, and I think Sandra would ultimately flip Dara and Lil at the final 5, be more successful there, take out Burton, and from there I think the rest of the season would play out pretty similarly. So ultimately, while things do get a bit more interesting, I don't think much actually changes. Now we're moving on to Survivor All-Stars, and we have quite the doozy here, where Amber was the first out of the Endurance Challenge, and obviously Amber was the winner of the season, and this would change a decent amount. However, if I'm being perfectly honest, I think at the end of the day, it would simply result in a Boss and Rob win. So first up, I think Sheehan would still be the consensus target at 6, and given Big Tom won that immunity, I don't think that changes either. At Final 5, that's where things could get interesting, because on one hand, Alicia would be the consensus target, and with Amber out of the game, Big Tom would feel less threatened about the Final 4 deal he was left out of. But on the other hand, I don't think Rob would want to go to 4 with both Rupert and Tom, plus he probably assumes that Alicia would be easier to beat than either of them. So I actually think Rob would push for a Big Tom vote anyway at Final 5 to better his odds of getting to the end. With that, the end game should play out pretty similar as a real life scenario, with Rupert being cut at 4. And at 3, Rob most likely wins final immunity and has to choose between Alicia and Jenna. I feel like either final 2 produces a similar jury vote in which Rob wins. I think whoever Rob takes would have Lex and possibly Big Tom. Now it could be more up in the air now depending on how differently Rob handles the final 5, but I assume Tom wouldn't vote for Rob either way, while Rob himself would have the lock votes of Kathy, Rupert, and Amber. And if Rob takes Jenna, he possibly loses Alicia's vote depending on if he made a final 2 deal to get her loyalty, but he would definitely get Sheehan's vote, so he would win regardless. And if Rob takes Alicia, Sheehan becomes a bit more debatable, though I consider she didn't have the best relationship with Alicia either. Rob probably gets it anyway, and he would still get Jenna's vote. So really the season doesn't change too much, with the main outcome being that Rob wins, though obviously the main difference would be that Alicia would be taken further in the game, and we probably never get Redemption Island, so take that as you will. Now we're moving on to Survivor Vanuatu. We're at the final 7. It's a bit weird because it's actually the Loved Ones challenge, and they actually have the players compete with their loved ones in it. It's the blindfold challenge. This was quite famously the challenge where Chris told his wife that he was going to go home if they lost. Even so, Eliza and Leanne were in the bottom two, and it's unclear which one was actually in last, though based on the edit, it's implied Eliza did edge out Leanne, so obviously Leanne would go out through do or die, and considering she was the actual Final 7 boot, it doesn't seem like much changes, though I do wonder how the flip would play out, as a big reason Eliza flipped to Scout and Twyla was because Amy, Leanne, and Julie were planning to vote her out at 7 despite Chris being the last man standing. I would guess the alliance still comes together anyway with Chris getting Eliza on board, and through that, I think the rest of the season would play out as normal. Now moving on to Survivor Palau, where at the final 7, we have the players breaking tiles with coconuts, again showing that how great this format works. And Stephanie was in last place with only 2 tiles broken, and given she was the actual Final 7 boot, not too much changes. The rest of the season plays out as normal. Now moving on to Survivor Guatemala, where at the final 7 we have the Folklore Challenge, and here we have Judd coming in last place and falling victim to do or die. So first up, I think at the final 6, I think Gary still gets voted out, unless Danny is able to convince Rafe to cut Cindy, which I don't think is particularly likely. Even so, I think Danny still gets into Rafe's ear, prompting the rest of the game to play out like normal. I think the main difference here is that Judd is probably slightly less bitter at Stephanie, as she no longer betrays him as what happened in real life, but I don't think it's enough to really change the outcome. I think Danny still is able to get Rafe to take her to the final 3, where she wins final immunity, cuts Rafe, and ultimately beats Stephanie at the end. Now moving on to Survivor Panama, and this was one of the exceptions I talked about at the beginning of the video, where obviously at the final 7, Bruce was medevaced before the immunity challenge, meaning that round got canceled. So for that exercise, I'm instead going to use the final 6 immunity challenge. But realistically, if Bruce were there, I think he probably comes in last for this one as well. Though if we are basing it off what actually happened, Shane was the first one out of that challenge. So I feel like Shane going out could make things a bit more interesting, where I feel like the final 6, we probably don't get the 3-2-1, as now Sari feels like, well, Terry is the only one taking Courtney to the end, whereas before she saw that both Terry and Shane were treating Courtney as a goat. I feel like now Sari's probably a bit more secure in her position in the game, though I think she probably might consider taking Courtney to the end. I think she ultimately stays true to her original group there of her, Aris, and Danielle. And I think through that, they possibly vote out Courtney at the final 6, though it is a bit more wonky there with Bruce, assuming that's what happens. Though I guess, I mean, if we are assuming Bruce still gets medevac, it's probably not going to be the final 5, I guess, which in that case, like, that alliance straight up has the numbers to vote out Courtney. And then from there, the rest of the game plays out normal. So again, a bit of a wonkier example, but I think at the end of the day, not too much changes. Now moving on to Survivor Cook Islands, where at the final 7, we have an obstacle course challenge, which was very brutal and looked very painful. Now, this is also a weird example because if we're looking at the actual footage, it seemed like Sundra was in last place. However, considering the fact that at this point in the season, the I2s had the clear majority and were at this point just picking off the old raros, I think there's a chance that Sundra sits out of this challenge, especially with the knowledge that Ozzy is there to win it for them and potentially take away that one opportunity for Adam and Parvati to get something for themselves. So I think there is a debate for Sundra sitting out of this challenge, in which in that case, I feel like Parvati is the one that would be in last place. If that's the case, then I think not much changes, where I think Penner still goes out at 6, with Adam making the deal with Yule to give him his jury vote only if Penner goes out before him. And from there, the rest of the season plays out as normal. However, if we are assuming that no one sits out and Sundra really is the boot, that makes things slightly more interesting, as it would mean the I2 alliance would only tie coming into the final 6, making the Penner plan a bit less certain. And there's 2 ways this could go. Either the I2s keep Penner in their corner one more round and possibly vote out Parvati in their place, with Yule approaching Adam with a similar deal, cut Penner at 5, Adam at 4, and Yule still wins. Or if Adam and Parvati are so repulsed by Penner they don't even want to bother, they and the I2s pile their votes onto Penner at 6 anyway, and from there the rest of the season plays out normal. Either way, I still think Yule and Ozzy are the two most likely winners of the season. So again, while I think Sundra realistically would sit out of this challenge, I feel like it doesn't really change much whether it's her or Parvati in last place. Now we're moving on to Survivor Fiji, which is another weird challenge, not just because it's a multi-part challenge, but it was also a challenge in which Boo was able to get an advantage from the auction, which again, if this do or die twist was being applied, they probably wouldn't do that for this season, but we just have to roll with it. Now, Cassandra was clearly in last place where she was barely trying in it. However, given how out of it she was and how Alex was the consensus target, to where all her alliance needed was for Alex to not win, it's possible she sits out of this challenge again, similar to Cook Islands. But for the sake of this video, let's say Cassandra is the victim here anyway. In that case, we get to the final 6 where Dreams and Yellowman still have their car deal. The question is whether Dreams still tries to blindside Yellowman at 6 or if it becomes the standard Alex vote as it was at the final 7. Where on one hand, I think Alex was such an outsider at that point that targeting him would keep the alliance unified. But on the other hand, I think Dreams recognized the need to blindside Yellowman before 5, as it was more likely Yellowman would play the idol at 5 due to that being the last time he can play the idol anyway, and obviously with him not wanting to actually uphold the deal, and with Alex being in self-preservation mode, I can see Alex jumping on board with this plan. So I still think the flip would happen, Yellowman probably plays the idol. However, the main difference here is that he and Earl now vote out Alex, so Alex still goes home at 6 regardless. And through that, I think the rest of the season still plays out similarly, except now Stacy takes Cassandra's spot in the final 3, and Earl still wins the season by a wide margin. So again, we do still have some intrigue, but at the end of the day, it doesn't actually change that much. Now we're moving on to Survivor China, where we have a multi-bar challenge involving tossing metal stars. And this one was very easy to identify. PG had the lowest score with 0, and given the fact that she was at the bottom at this point, I mean, she has no reason to not play in this challenge. And despite that, I think this actually changes quite a bit, as in real life, this was the round where James goes home with 2 idols in his pocket, or bag, I guess. But now that James is in the final 6 with only 2 rounds left where he can play his idols, he probably doesn't make that same mistake. With that in mind, Eric still probably goes out at 6, given he's now the only remaining John Who member. Final 5 is where things could definitely get interesting, because on one hand, Todd, Amanda, and Courtney would probably target Denise under the assumption that James uses the idol on himself. In that case, James would be cut at 4, and the same thing happens. But given that James is closer to Denise, I think there's a chance he could use his idol on Denise and take out Todd, where in that case, I think he and Denise would come into the final 4 as a pair, to a degree, I guess. And assuming Amanda still wins final immunity, James would probably go into fire making with Courtney, but I think regardless, Amanda would have the advantage in a jury vote and win. So I think this actually changes more than people would expect. I mean, not so much because of the person going out, but more so because of the thing that was prevented by this twist. And I think through that, James can use his idols effectively, or at least more effectively than he did in real life, and change the outcome of the game. Though I think by the end of it, I think Amanda would have the best shot of winning at the end. Now we're moving on to Survivor Micronesia, which is the other exception to the rule I mentioned at the beginning, where similar to Panama, there was no Final 7 immunity challenge as James was medevaced. So with that, we had to use the Final 6 immunity, which was shooting paint bottles. And with that, we have Sarit and Alexis being tied for last with 0 bottles hit by the end, which is a bit unfortunate, but again, it gives us a bit more scenarios to cover. However, if I'm being honest, I don't think much changes either, where obviously if James or Alexis were in last, assuming James wasn't medevaced, not much changes. But if Sarit is considered last place, I think the end game, even then, is probably pretty similar, with Alexis more than likely taking Sarit's place. And through that, we get to a similar final 3 of Alexis, Amanda, and Parvati. We're assuming Amanda still wins final immunity, she probably still takes Parvati and loses. Though if Alexis wins final immunity, my guess is she takes Parvati to the end. And in that case, I assume Parvati still wins, though I don't think it's as much of a guarantee, but it does change the end game a bit. Now moving on to Survivor Gabon, where at the final 7 we have a ball tossing challenge with the number of balls determined by trivia questions. And here, again, it's pretty clear, Susie got the least amount of questions right, and her quote unquote best ball was the furthest from the center. And this could be interesting with Susie going out. So, first up, we get to the final six where Bob wins immunity once again, and this enables Bob and Corinne to attempt the fake idol plan at the final six. Now, assuming Ken still believes it, that'll give Bob and Corinne at least a tie at that vote. And it's more so a matter of if they can also get Crystal on board to blindside Maddie. And while I think they would get the numbers in this scenario, Maddie has an idol and would most likely play it, sending Corinne out instead. So obviously that doesn't change. At the final five, Bob still wins immunity, and I think Ken goes here as well. While they could go Crystal, I think they would have viewed Ken as a bigger threat. And at the final four, obviously we see Susie win that immunity in the real life scenario, but here we know Maddie came in second, and I doubt Crystal wins it. So with that, I think Maddie wins that. Crystal is voted out at final four, giving us a Bob, Maddie, Sugar final three, which I think Maddie wins. So again, some interesting stuff in the end game, and obviously a different winner. Now we're moving on to Survivor Tocantins, where at the final seven we have a multi-part challenge involving using grappling hooks to retrieve bags. And in this case, we see Erin being the last to receive her first bag, and obviously she most likely goes out through do or die. And this could potentially shake up the end game, where first up, I think Sierra will be taken out 6 as a consensus target. Not too exciting there. But I think at Final 5 is where things could get interesting, as at that point, Steven recognizes that JT is a threat and would try to get him out, much like he did in real life. With one less number for the Jalapao side, he's now more of a swing vote, and with how Aaron specifically, he doesn't have a safe Final 2 opponent in the Jalapao side. So does he flip to cut Taj? Now, granted, I think cutting Taj here would be the wrong move for Steven, as it opens him up to be cut at 4. So realistically, I think he still sticks with the Jalapaos and cuts Coach, and through that, I think the endgame plays out pretty similarly with Debbie taking Aaron's place, and with JT winning out, we still get the same final 2 between JT and Steven, and JT still wins here. So again, I think realistically, the endgame is still pretty similar, but I think there's still now a potential for there to be a flip at the 5, which obviously would change the endgame quite a bit, but it's still a possibility to consider. Now we're moving on to Survivor Samoa, where at the final 7 we have a basket tossing challenge, and not much changes here. I mean, Monica is in last place. She was the real life final 7 boot. Not much changes. I mean, admittedly, the one thing that could change slightly is how her situation with Russell plays out, where Russell may be less likely to get upset at her accusations of him already being rich, but I still think she would vote for Natalie at Final Tribal anyway. So I think at the end of the day, not much changes, but that's just one possibility there. Now moving on to Heroes versus Villains, where at the final 7, we have a multi-part challenge involving a pig maze, and Colby was the last to retrieve his pig and start the maze. But interestingly, by the end, I mean, if we're looking at the edit, it actually looks like he got ahead of Jerry. So I actually think Jerry would be eliminated through do or die here. But regardless, I don't think it's that interesting. I feel like Rupert and Colby would still go up back to back, as Russell wouldn't risk blindside Danielle at 6, and especially not Final 5, with 2 heroes still in the game. In Final 4, I mean, that's where things could get interesting a bit, as Russell wins Final Immunity, and I think at that point he does cut Parvati, thinking Danielle will be easier to beat at the end, but through that, I think Sandra still wins, and possibly with the same votes as well. I mean, with Danielle getting all the same votes that Parvati got in the real life scenario. So again, I don't think much changes. I think Danielle more than likely takes Parvati's place at the end. Now moving on to Survivor Nicaragua, where at the final 7, we have a multi-part challenge involving getting ropes to retrieve coins. And it's not exactly clear who is the furthest from completing the first part, though looking at the edit, it seems like Dan was that person. And admittedly, I think this leads to a larger similar endgame. I think the main source of intrigue is whether Benry can compete with Fabio in the immunity challenges. While Benry was voted out in the original Final 7 due to being a big threat, he is pretty similar in body type to Fabio and could be Fabio's biggest competitor. Now with that in mind, if Benry is able to beat Fabio at Final 6 or even Final 5, then Fabio would be voted out there. However, if Fabio still wins those immunities, I think the majority would vote out Benry and Jane back to back, much like the real life scenario. And if Fabio completely wins out, we get the same Final 3 where Fabio still wins. However, if Benry or Jane are able to stop Fabio along the way and get Fabio out, then again, both of them will be at the bottom and would have to win out themselves. if the majority is able to get out both of them, I think Chase is the most likely winner of the season. However, if Benry or Jane are able to slip in there, I think either of them would have a shot. However, I still would place quite a bit of bets on Chase winning. So again, we do have some intrigue here at the final 7 of Nicaragua, though I don't think it's a guarantee. Now we're moving on to Redemption Island, where once again we show just how brilliant this format would have worked on this season. We're literally at the final 7. The immunity challenge happens right after a tribal. It's the second part of a double tribal, and they literally have a trivia or a memory comp. And in this case, we have Natalie and Philip being eliminated at the same time. And obviously, that presents two different scenarios. But honestly, I feel like both scenarios produce largely the same result, where I think Steve still goes out at 6, Andrea goes out at 5. Now, the one possible deviation is that if Natalie is the one eliminated through do or die, she could end up returning through Redemption Island, as she is a similar body build and possibly a similar skill set and challenges to Andrea. But more than likely, I think Andrea would return regardless. And from there, Andrea would still go out of 5. At 4, I'm pretty sure Rob cuts Grant, as he's the most likely person to beat him in a jury vote. And through that, we get a final 3 of Rob, Ashley, and whoever survives to do or die. And I think Rob still wins his final 3. Now, while Ashley is a bit more palatable as an alternative to Rob and probably gets some votes, I just don't think it'll be enough. I think Rob still probably pulls it out. Again, Ashley could get a few more Zapatero votes, but I think Rob still edges it out. Now we're moving on to Survivor South Pacific, where at the final 7, we have a multi-part second chance challenge. And we see here that Edna was in last place for the first part, as she was the only one to not even land a second bag. And obviously she goes out through do or die. And this is pretty boring if I'm being perfectly honest. The Opolus stick together while Cochran essentially has to win out, which I don't think he'll be able to do. A big reason for that is that the final 6 immunity challenge is the one where the players move across the board and turn over tile pieces to eliminate others. And given how that challenge makes it very easy for the majority to gang up on one person, I can see the Opolus ganging up on Cochran, making it very unlikely he wins that challenge anyway. And through that, Cochran goes out, Ozzy most likely returns from Redemption, and the rest of the season plays out as normal, so not too exciting there. Now we're moving on to Survivor One World. We're at the final 7 endurance challenge. Sabrina is the first one out. Now theoretically, she should have sat out given that Kat and Tarzan were consensus targets there, but at the end of the day, it's Survivor One World. It doesn't matter because all roads lead to Kim winning. Now the only difference here is that Christina most likely takes Sabrina's spot in the final 3, but even then, it's Survivor One World. Kim wins, getting the same votes. There's not much to discuss. Now moving on to Survivor Philippines, where at the final 7, we have a multi-part challenge involving rope mazes, with players having weight added depending on their answers to trivia questions. And again, another challenge showing the brilliance of this format because Abby Maria wins an advantage that allows her to skip to the third part. So obviously, they wouldn't do this if they actually did it, but this one was actually very easy as Lisa's the only one eliminated following the first round for coming in last, and obviously she's eliminated through do or die, and this could be interesting. Now, first up, I think we have a potentially interesting final 6 with Malcolm and Denise on one side, Carter and Penner on another, and Scoopin and Abby Maria in the middle. Abby Maria more than likely sides with the Carter-Penner contingent, it's essentially leaving Scoopin as a swing vote there. Now I guess that Scoopin sides with Malcolm and Denise, given Penner turned down his final 4 deal in the real life scenario, but that was with Lisa still in the game. But with Lisa now out and the Carter-Penner side now holding the numbers, I'm going to say that Scoopin flips and votes out Denise at 6, and at 5, Scoopin probably gets flipped on after Malcolm wins immunity, so obviously that paid off for Scoopin. At final 4, I think the game comes down to who wins final immunity, where if anyone other than Malcolm wins, Malcolm gets voted out, giving us a Carter, Penner, Abby Maria final 3, where I assume Carter wins. Now, Penner could get some votes, but I assume Carter has the advantage. On the other hand, if Malcolm wins final immunity, it essentially becomes a fight between Carter and Penner, where I assume Malcolm would vote out Carter due to being a bigger jury threat, leaving Abby Maria as the deciding vote. Now, regardless, I think Malcolm wins against either Carter or Penner at the end, and obviously wins against Abby Maria as well. So I don't think it matters too much, although I think if I were to assume Carter is the most likely person voted out there. Now we're moving on to Survivor Caramoan, where at the final 7, we have a challenge involving moving a buoy through a rope maze, building a ladder to climb a tower, and here we see Sherry clearly in last place. And admittedly, this doesn't change too much either, where Brenda and Andrea would be the next 2 targets. Now, Andrea's idol could shake things up to a degree, but I think Eddie would just be the backup target anyway. And assuming Eric is still medevaced at the final 5, we most likely get a Cochran Dawn Eddie final 3, where Cochran easily wins. But even in an Andrea Cochran Dawn final 3, while Andrea could get 1 or 2 votes, I think Cochran still wins that very handily, so I don't think much changes there. Now we're moving on to Survivor Blood versus Water, where at the final 7, Katie is the first one eliminated from the challenge and is the victim of do or die. And honestly, not much changes. I mean, final 6 could be interesting, as while the newbies and returnees would still be tied in numbers, the returnees wouldn't be under the assumption that Sierra is on their side, so it's possible Tyson actually plays his idol this time, increasing the possibility that Sierra or possibly Caleb flip on the revote, as it would mean that if they went to rocks as they did in the real life scenario, that the newbies are guaranteed to lose one of their own numbers. So I think the returnees still went out on this vote and probably run the table from that point on. And assuming Tina still returns from Redemption Island, we get a very similar endgame where we get the same final 3 of Tyson, Jervis, and Monica, and Tyson still wins. Now we're moving on to Survivor Cagayan, where at the final 7, we have the challenge of digging through sand, untying bags, and a table maze at the end. And Trish was the last to finish the digging portion and appeared to be behind Cass with untying the bags. And admittedly, I don't think this changes too much, although Tony would have a bit of a tougher road without Trish there to mend things over after his flips. But I think the endgame is still pretty similar, with the main difference being that Tony probably votes out Tasha before Jeffra, as a big reason Tony flipped on Jeffra in real life was because Spencer convinced him that Jeffra was going to flip on him, which was true at a point, but Jeffra did back off by the time the accusation was made. But it was also at the final 7 in real life when Tony knew he still had Trish with him. But now with Trish absent and Tasha being more loyal to Spencer, I think Tony would want to weaken Spencer by voting out Tasha at 6. So I think that would go through. At final 5, Jeffrey goes out, again, sort of reverse order. And then from there, the rest of the season plays out normal, where Tony still wins. Now moving on to Survivor San Juan del Sur, where at the final 7, we have a race to stack and balance blocks on a wobbly table. And Alex appeared to be in last place at the end of the challenge. Again, it's not entirely clear based on the footage, but that's what it seems to be based on some aerial shots. And considering he was the actual Final 7 boot, not much changes. So there's that. Now we're moving on to Survivor Worlds Apart, where at the Final 7, we have an endurance challenge, and Will is the first out of the challenge. And admittedly, the endgame isn't too exciting, as Mike would still win out, and would also still have an idol at the Final 6. But if I had to guess, I would say Tyler still voted out at 6 for being a jury threat, and possibly through a Carolyn idol play as well. At final 5, I think Sierra is still voted out there. And at 4, we could still see a Carolyn Rodney fire-making challenge. However, with Will being out at 7 and weakening Rodney, I could see Dan becoming more loyal to Mike in the endgame. So through that, maybe Rodney is voted out 3-1. But regardless, we get a Mike, Carolyn, Dan final 3, where Mike still wins. Now we're moving on to Survivor Cambodia, where at the final 7, we have an obstacle course in the water, and the same 5-piece puzzle that was utilized in Worlds Apart but wasn't used, and the one where Spencer studied it and was able to solve it in 5 seconds. And this was also the challenge where Tasha struggled in the water and had to be rescued, and Tasha was in last place, although again, a lot of that was because she was struggling and had to be rescued. So considering that, there is a chance that she sits it out and doesn't take that risk, which in that case, that would leave Abby Maria and Kimmy in the back of the pack. Now, if Abby is considered last place, nothing changes. She's the real-life Final 7 boot. However, if Kimmy is eliminated, I don't think much changes either, as at the Final 6 would be different, as Jeremy wouldn't be tricked into thinking Abby Maria hadn't flipped, as she was already on the other side. So as a result, I think he would try to get Keith on his side so he can split the vote between Wentworth and Abby Maria. And I actually think Jeremy would be effective in doing so they would be able to have 4 people against just Wentworth and Abby Maria, split the vote there. And assuming Abby Wentworth plays the idol on herself as she did in real life, Abby Maria would be voted out at 6. And from there, I think the rest of the season would play out as normal. Now we're moving on to Survivor Koh, where at the final 7 we have a number and word puzzle. And this is another tough one, as on one hand, Joe was clearly in last place, even telling Jeff that he was going to sit out of the challenge. However, there were multiple people still trying to figure out the combination when Michelle won, so it's unclear who was the next person in last place. So just for simplicity, I'm just going to say Joe was the boot here. However, we probably still see a Julia boot at Final 6 if that's the case, as she was a clear outsider. Final 5 could be interesting, as Jason would still be in the game. However, Aubrey, Sydney, and Ty would have the numbers to turn on Michelle for being a bigger jury threat. Now, I think realistically they play it safe and vote out Jason in the hopes that they could beat Michelle at Final Immunity, though obviously we know from real life that they fail. If, on the other hand, they vote out Michelle at 5, then Jason would be the clear target at 4, and assuming they get him out, we would get an Aubrey, Sydney, Ty Final 3, where I assume Aubrey wins, though I think if Ty would get some votes in that scenario. However, on the other hand, if Jason does win Final Immunity, I think we still get an Aubrey, Sydney fire-making challenge, as I don't think Jason would have wanted to go up against Aubrey at the end, but assuming Aubrey still beats Sydney in that fire-making challenge, I think it becomes a pretty clear Aubrey win. So I feel like regardless if Joe goes out through do or die, I think there's a very high likelihood that Aubrey wins the game. Now we're moving on to Survivor Millennials versus Generation X, where at the final 7 we have the pinball puzzle challenge, the same one that Adam was trying to help Ken win. And honestly, this was another really tough one to figure out who was in last place. Now, some of that was due to the unbalanced editing, where it was hard to see who was actually in the back of the pack. But a lot of it also stems to the format of the puzzle, which made it hard to see how much progress people were actually making. Now, it appears to be between Adam, Sunday, and Brett at the back of the pack, as Adam was trying to help Ken win towards the end. But I feel like in a situation where last place could have gone home, I feel like he would have tried harder on his own puzzle. That which leaves us with Brett and Sunday, who got almost no screen time during the challenge. However, looking at some background shots when Jeff was handing out the necklace to Ken at the end, those suggest that Sunday had more progress than Brett, which would make Brett in last place. Now, considering Sunday was the actual Final 7 boot, I'll assume that Brett was the one to go out through do or die here. Now, admittedly, I don't think this is too interesting, as I feel like Sunday would largely take Brett's spot there. Obviously, her and Jay would have been at the bottom at the final 6. I still think Jay is voted out at 6 due to being the bigger threat. And at 5, while I don't think she would have been as on board to side with Adam to vote out David, I still think she probably joins the plan anyway, as I don't really see her getting to the end with Hannah or Ken, or David for that matter. It's just a matter of if Hannah is still going to go to their side, which I don't think she would. I don't think Sunday would really move the needle there. So with that, I think Sunday would still go out in 5th, and from there, I think the rest of the season would play out as normal. Now we're moving on to Survivor Game Changers. We're at the final 7. This is the challenge where you have to stand on a perch and pour water into a bucket, followed by a puzzle at the end. Now, Suri was the last to get her key, and she never seemed to be in contention during the puzzle stage. So I will be considering her to be last, although you could make the argument that she could have sat out, but I don't think she was entirely safe to do so, but that it is what it is. And honestly, I don't think it changes too much, where at 6, I wouldn't be surprised if we get a very similar result, with Michaela now taking Suri's spot as the victim of Advantage Get-In. And if that's the case, I think the rest of the game plays out very similarly, with Aubrey going out at 5, Ty at 4, and then we get the same final 3, and Sarah still wins. Now we're moving on to Survivor Heroes versus Healers versus Hustlers, where at the final 7, we actually have an endurance challenge, and a pretty interesting one, as Ben is the first one out, and with Ben obviously being the winner of the season, this obviously changes quite a bit. Now first up, I think Mike is voted out at the final 6 as the last remaining healer. At 5, Lauren Rimmer will probably be the next target, unless she plays an idol or wins immunity. Now if she does end up getting safety, I think Ashley's probably the backup target there. And then at 4, Chrissy's met with the fire-making challenge twist, and I can see her sending Devin and Ashley, or Lauren if she stays, where if Devin wins, I think he probably wins the game in a close jury vote, but if Ashley or Lauren win, I think Ryan probably has the best shot, I don't think Ashley or Lauren would beat Ryan at the end of the day, so I feel like that's something. But ultimately, I think it would lead to a radically different result. Now, moving on to Survivor Ghost Island, where at the final 7, we have a multi part challenge involving a bridge puzzle, ladder, and slide puzzle. And this was also the challenge where Wendell finished the puzzle first, but he didn't call Jeff's name, and through that, Laurel won it. And here, Angela was clearly in last place, and this essentially changes nothing. I mean, Kellen goes out at 6, Seabass at 5. Final 4 could be interesting with Dom's decision for fire making. I assume he would now send Donathan to fire against Wendell, and just like the real life scenario, this would essentially decide the game, where if Wendell wins, we probably get the same outcome with a tied jury vote followed by Wendell winning. It's certainly possible that in this scenario, Donathan may be more appreciative of Dom for at least giving him a chance to save himself through fire, but I think he would still vote for Wendell anyway. However, if Donathan wins fire making and sends Wendell out, I think Dominic clearly wins the game. Again, Dominic beats pretty much everyone except for Wendell, so through that, I think it really just comes down to the fire making challenge, but at the end of the day, it doesn't change too much. Now we're moving on to Survivor David versus Goliath, where at the final 7, we do have an endurance challenge, and in that one, Kara is the first one out, and this shouldn't change much. I mean, Christian still goes out at 6, assuming he doesn't win immunity, given how massive of a target he is at this point. Final 5 could be interesting if Nick sticks with Davey, but I think Nick likely sticks with the Goliath and votes out Davey, thinking Davey is the bigger threat. And then at 4, we probably see an Mike and Allison fire making challenge, where if Mike wins, we get the same result. But if Allison wins, I actually think it'll be a relatively close jury vote between her and Nick, although I think Nick would edge it out. However, it would definitely be interesting to watch. Now we're moving on to Survivor Edge of Extinction, where at the final 7, we have an endurance challenge again. This time, Rick Devens is the first one out and would be the victim of Do or Die. And this obviously changes quite a bit, where at the final 6, Ron becomes the biggest target on the board unless he wins immunity, but I assume he wouldn't, and through that would go out here. Again, for the sake of simplicity, moving forward to the Edge challenge, let's assume Chris still comes back from the Edge, although I think Devens would have a shot in that challenge. Now, without Devens, I think Chris would try to align with Lauren, the only remaining person from his original tribe, and possibly Gavin and Julie. But now without Devens to play an idol on him and to serve as a bigger threat, I don't see these people having much incentive to keep Chris around. So actually, I think Chris goes out in 6. Now from there, we're looking at a pretty different endgame, where I think Gavin, Julie, and Lauren stick together to target Victoria and Aurora. Now, while I think those two could try to flip Lauren, I feel like Gavin, Julie, and Lauren are the most likely final 3 scenario, where Gavin probably wins. So again, in an endgame without Rick Devens, that obviously gives Chris a lot less room to maneuver, and through that, we probably get a very boring but different winner. Now we're moving on to Survivor Island of the Idols, where at the final 7, we have a balance beam and word puzzle. Now Janet appeared to be the furthest away from solving it, plus she was the last to finish the balance beam portion, so I'm going to assume Janet is the one to go out here. And this is very straightforward. I mean, assuming Dan is still ejected at the final 6, Elaine becomes the very clear target at 5, and without an idol or need for an idol nullifier, like she would go out there, we get to the same final 4 as the real life scenario, where the rest of the season essentially plays out as normal. And finally, we have Survivor Winners at War, the last season to not have Do or Die, where at the final 7, we have a tossing ball challenge followed by a slide puzzle, and this is a very clear and easy final person, with Michelle being in last place, the only person to not finish the ball portion. And on the surface, you'd think this would be very straightforward, where obviously Michelle was a very clear person on the outs that was benefited by Natalie coming back into the game and gave Natalie a number moving forward. And for the most part, it is pretty straightforward, although things could get very interesting. Now, Michelle did win the final 6 immunity challenge, but with Ben in second place, even with a disadvantage, I feel like he's the most likely winner of that immunity challenge, and that would lead to Jeremy going out there. After that, I assume Natalie still comes back from the edge, as Michelle would be at a massive disadvantage due to not having enough fire tokens to get advantages, and we obviously saw how Jeremy did in the actual challenge. Now with that, we get to the second final 6 round, which probably plays out similarly with Natalie playing her idol. Nick may try to flip and take Michelle's role in that, but I think he's the most likely safe vote there. Now, final five, though, is where things get a bit more interesting, as I now wonder whether Ben would still tell Sarah to vote him out, because now with Denise there instead of Michelle, it becomes a lot tougher for Sarah and Natalie to pull such a move off against Ben. So I assume that deal probably doesn't happen and they stick to a safe Denise vote, which then leads us to the final four, where again, things could get very, very interesting. Now, let's assume Natalie still wins final immunity. She would still target Tony. However, now that Ben is there in the final four instead of Michelle, like someone that's proven to be much better at fire making than Sarah, Natalie might actually put Ben in the fire making challenge against Tony. Now, assuming Ben beats Tony, which seems pretty likely, we would get a Ben, Natalie, Sarah final three, where Sarah most likely wins. Though if Tony somehow beats Tony, we would get a Natalie, Sarah, Tony final three, where Tony clearly wins. But now let's back up and let's say Ben beats Natalie in the final immunity challenge, which, could happen. In that case, I'm assuming he would want Sarah to win, but recognizes that Tony is the biggest jury threat on the board. So through that, I think there's a good chance he sends Tony and Natalie to fire, where I assume Natalie beats him. Again, Tony is not very good at fire. And if that's the case, we would get the same Ben, Natalie, Sarah final three, where Natalie may get a bit more respect now that she's beaten Tony in firemaking, but it probably won't be enough, and Sarah most likely wins Winners at War. Now, before I wrap up this video, I did want to briefly touch on 41, which did have Do or Die with Deshawn. However, Deshawn obviously survived Do or Die. But what would have happened if Deshawn was taken out there? Now, to be honest, I don't think much changes there, where first I think Danny is voted out at 6, as he was a much bigger jury threat than Liana. Final 5, could be interesting. I could see Xander or Ricard trying to flip Liana. Maybe Xander uses that opportunity to use this extra vote instead of the final 7. Although, honestly, I think Liana probably sides more with Erica and Heather, especially against Xander, and votes out Ricard there, who's a much clearer jury threat. In a final 4, Xander still probably saves Erica, sending Liana and Heather to fire, where Erica probably wins either way, but I think Heather would get a vote from Ricard if she got to the end, while Liana would most likely get a vote from Shan if she got to the end. But regardless, I don't think much changes. Erica still probably wins. And there we go. That will do it for this week's video. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe. It really helps out the channel. As usual, I am still covering Survivor 42, so you can look forward to those power rankings. The Circle should be coming out right about now, so you can expect videos coming out for that. Big Brother Canada is wrapping up, so you can expect some postseason coverage for that. And I do want to make more videos like this moving forward where I talk more generally about Survivor. I think it'll be very interesting to talk about different stuff. I have some ideas planned. Stay tuned for that. But for now, that is the video. See ya.